The millionaire's son suffered from frequent and violent seizures. The most expensive medicines in the world no longer worked, and the doctors were out of options. It was in this atmosphere of desperation that a simple cleaning lady was hired. One day, the father heard the sound of water and ran to the bathroom. The scene he saw left him frozen with terror. His son was convulsing violently, and the cleaning lady, instead of calling an ambulance, was submerging him in a bathtub full of ice. He opened his mouth to scream, but hesitated for a moment. What he did next was a desperate act of faith that changed everything. The silence in Arthur Dumont's mansion was a tapestry woven with threads of gold and fear. Every marble hallway, every crystal chandelier, and every masterpiece hanging on the high walls echoed the vastness of his fortune, but also the depth of his emptiness. Arthur, a man who had built an empire from daring Wall Street investments, who had spun a small initial capital into a net worth of billions, felt like the poorest of men. His greatest treasure, his only son, 5-year-old Leo, slept in the next room, and his every breath was a sound Arthur monitored with the same intensity he tracked the cash flow of his businesses. He was a haunted multimillionaire, a king in a castle of panic. The loss of his wife years earlier, to an illness that came like a thief in the night, had left a wound that never healed. The possibility of losing Leo was an abyss he refused to face. The nurse, Veronica Hayes, moved through Leo's room with a cold, uncalculated efficiency. Her gestures were precise, her reports impeccable. She was the best money could buy, recommended by the most renowned physicians. She administered the imported antipyretics with protocol-like rigidity, noting every tenth of a degree on her digital chart. To her, Leo was a set of symptoms to be managed, a delicate biological system in need of constant surveillance. But the terror wasn't in the fever's numbers, but in the speed at which they climbed, turning his sweet, laughing boy into a small, trembling body, lost in a seizure that stole the light from his eyes. The medicines, once effective, now seemed like empty promises, and each new crisis was longer, more frightening than the last. That morning, a new employee was admitted to the house. Her name was Helena. She didn't arrive in a luxury car, nor did she carry an impressive resume. Her credentials were hands calloused from a life of hard work in the country, and a gaze that held the serenity of someone who understands the cycles of life and nature. Hired as a housekeeper, she moved through the opulent rooms with a discretion that made her almost invisible. As she polished the silver and dusted the expensive furniture, her eyes absorbed the heavy atmosphere of the home. She saw the stiffness in Veronica's posture, the pain etched on the father's face, and, passing by the half-open door to Leo's room, she saw the boy. He wasn't a protocol to her. He was a small flame, fragile and flickering, in need of warmth and protection, not just measurement and medication. Late that afternoon, while tidying the upstairs hallway, Helena felt a subtle shift in the air, a current of heat emanating from the child's room. Veronica was on the phone downstairs, arguing with a pharmacist about importing a new experimental drug from Europe, a costly application that would add to the house's already substantial liabilities. Arthur, in his study, tried to focus on a cryptocurrency chart, but his mind was miles away. Helena drew closer to the door, guided by an intuition older than any science. She watched Leo, who had begun to stir restlessly in his sleep. A faint flush was spreading across his cheeks, almost imperceptible. The nurse wouldn't see it. The father was too distracted. But Helena saw. She recognized that treacherous sign, the calm before the storm. It was starting. The fever wasn't just rising, it was skyrocketing. And no one but her seemed to have noticed the silent race toward disaster. Helena felt the heat in the air like an animal senses an approaching storm. It wasn't just the room's temperature, but a density, a charged stillness that preceded chaos. She finished polishing a vase in the hall. her movements deliberately slow to give her an excuse to linger. Inside, little Leo whimpered, a fragile sound that was a knife to Helena's heart. She saw, through the crack in the door, the boy's cheek, once flushed, now take on a vivid, feverish hue. Veronica finally ended her call and came up the stairs, her expression that of an executive closing a major deal. She entered the room without even noticing Helena's presence, her eyes fixed on the monitor beside the bed. A soft beep indicated the temperature, 101.8 degrees Fahrenheit. For the nurse, it was a data point. For Helena, it was an alarm. "It's rising according to the pattern," Veronica murmured to herself, jotting the number on her chart. "We'll observe the ascension curve before we intervene." Arthur appeared at the doorway, his face pale and tense. He had given up on deciphering his investment charts. The only return on investment that mattered now was in that room. How is he?" His voice was a raw whisper. "The fever is climbing, Arthur. It's to be expected," Veronica said. With a calmness Arthur found both reassuring and maddening. "The protocol is clear. We need to let the body react to understand the efficacy of the new treatment. Administering the antipyretic too early could mask the data." Arthur looked at his son, whose small hands were twitching slightly on the silk sheets. He thought of his vast fortune, his assets scattered across the globe, his hedge funds that generated profit even as he slept. What was any of it worth? He would sell every stock, liquidate his gold, empty his accounts in dollars and euros if it could buy the certainty of his son's health. "Are you sure? Shouldn't we do something?" It was then that Helena, moved by an impulse she couldn't contain, took a step forward. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice low and respectful but firm. "When my children got like this, with the fever climbing fast, I'd put cool cloths on their foreheads, on their wrists. It helped keep the fire from rising so high." Veronica turned slowly, a look of pure disbelief on her face. She sized Helena up from head to toe, from the simple cap on her hair to her worn shoes. "With all due respect," the nurse said, her voice dripping with condescension, "you were hired to clean. Leo's condition is extremely delicate and is being monitored by specialists. We don't need folk remedies." The contempt in Veronica's voice was like a slap. Arthur, a man accustomed to trusting experts and making decisions based on data and projections, felt cornered. On one side, science, protocol, the woman in whom he had placed his trust, and an exorbitant amount of money. On the other, the simple wisdom of a housekeeper. The choice, to him, seemed obvious. "Helena, I appreciate the concern, but please leave the medical matters to Ms. Hayes. Go back to your work." Helena stepped back, her heart aching not from humiliation, but from fear. She cast one last glance at Leo, whose small body gave a sudden jolt, an almost imperceptible spasm that was the harbinger of horror. She saw it, but the other two, immersed in their discussion of protocols and science, did not. The monitor beeped again. The temperature climbing another 1/10 of a degree. Veronica prepared an injection, still waiting for the right moment, while Arthur ran his hands through his hair, a prisoner of his own helplessness. Helena, standing in the hallway, knew with a terrifying certainty that they were waiting too long. Their time was running out. The spasm Helena saw was the silent herald of catastrophe. It lasted only a second, a flicker of Leo's eyelid, but to her, it was like the sound of glass shattering in the dead of night. In the room, the monitor flashed and beeped, registering 102.9 degrees. Arthur saw the number and his blood ran cold. Veronica, however, maintained her composure. "Almost at the intervention point," she said, more to herself than to Arthur, her voice a steel thread. But Leo's body didn't wait for the protocol. Suddenly he went rigid, his arms and legs stretched out with unnatural force, and a guttural sound, a strangled moan, escaped his throat. His eyes, previously closed in a feverish sleep, rolled back in his head, showing only the whites. The seizure had arrived, violent and unforgiving. Leo! Arthur's scream was a sound of pure agony. He lunged toward the bed, but stopped inches from his son, hands suspended in the air, terrified of touching the fragile, thrashing body and equally desperate that he could do nothing. It was impotence in its cruelest form. His entire empire, his vast wealth amassed over years of shrewd deals, the assets multiplying in accounts across the globe. It all turned to dust before this scene. He was just a father, witnessing the nightmare no treasure on earth could ward off. Veronica, in turn, was galvanized by the crisis. Her calm transformed into frenzied efficiency. "Stand back, Arthur. He's not conscious." "I need to administer the anticonvulsant," she commanded, grabbing the syringe she had already prepared. She tried to hold Leo's small, flailing arm. The needle hovered over his thin skin as the nurse struggled to find a vein. "He won't stop. I can't stabilize him." Her professional tone began to crack, revealing a thin layer of panic underneath. From the hallway, Helena watched the scene with her heart in her throat. Every passing second was torture. She saw the mistake, the fatal flaw in Veronica's approach. It wasn't the seizure that needed to be stopped with chemistry. It was the fire beneath it that needed to be extinguished. The boy's body was cooking from the inside, his brain simmering in a pressure cooker. The injection, even if it worked, would only be a palliative. The cause, the skyrocketing fever, would continue its destructive ascent. Maternal instinct, the wisdom passed down through generations of women who fought fevers with nothing but water and courage, screamed inside her. Finally, Veronica managed to give the injection. Arthur held his breath, praying, pleading with any higher power that would listen. Seconds dragged on like hours, but Leo's body did not stop shaking. The seizure continued, indifferent to the state-of-the-art medicine that had just entered his bloodstream. The nurse's face went pale. It's not working," she whispered, horror seizing her voice. "The fever spiked too fast. The drug isn't taking effect." It was the final straw for Arthur. Despair swallowed him whole. "Do something!" he bellowed, his voice raw with anguish. "Aren't you the best my money can buy? What good is all my fortune if I can't save my son?" In that moment of chaos and desperation, Arthur's eyes, searching for any glimmer of hope, met Helena's. Amidst his panic, he saw something that shocked him. There was no fear in the housekeeper's eyes. There was a fierce determination, a steel-like certainty that contrasted brutally with the nurse's confusion and his own terror. As Veronica began shouting into the phone at a doctor, Helena stepped into the room. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't offer advice. She simply acted. Ignoring the screams and the confusion, she crossed the room with an unshakable purpose and opened the door to Leo's ensuite bathroom, disappearing inside. Leo's bathroom was a sanctuary of luxury, with Italian marble tiles and gold-plated fixtures. In other circumstances, Helena might have marveled at the extravagance Arthur's wealth afforded, but now her eyes were fixed on a single objective, the bathtub, a deep, white monolith. In seconds, she twisted the faucets, unleashing a jet of the coldest water possible. Urgency was a fire in her veins. Overriding any fear of being reprimanded or fired, she knew that every second of uncontrolled fever was an irreparable risk. In the bedroom, the pandemonium escalated. Veronica, screaming into her cell phone, was listening to instructions from a distant doctor, but the words were meaningless noise to Arthur, who stood paralyzed beside the bed, watching his son convulse uncontrollably. The bathroom door was open, and the sound of running water seemed a distant, nonsensical murmur amidst the horror. Helena emerged from the bathroom and raced to the kitchen, taking the stairs 3 at a time. The head chef, accustomed to the mansion's imperturbable routine, was shocked to see the new housekeeper burst into the pantry. "Where's the ice?" Helena asked, her voice tense but not hysterical. The chef, bewildered, just pointed to the industrial ice machine. Helena didn't hesitate. She filled every available plastic bag with ice, grabbed them, and ran back upstairs at the same speed. Back in the room, Arthur and Veronica were in a heated argument. "We need to get him to the hospital," the father yelled. "The transport could worsen the seizure, Arthur. We have to wait for the drug to take effect," the nurse retorted. The sound of the bathroom door opening drew their attention. Helena entered carrying the bags of ice, her expression one of utter focus. She dumped the bags into the half-filled tub, the thermal shock making a sharp crackling sound. The water in the tub was now frigid, almost freezing. Veronica, seeing this, let out a scream of indignation mixed with dread. "What do you think you're doing? That's insane! You'll send him into hypothermic shock!" Helena ignored the nurse. Her eyes were fixed on Leo. He wouldn't stop shaking. Without a word, she approached the bed. Arthur, seeing the determination in the housekeeper's eyes, hesitated. There was something in her that transcended logic and protocol, a force he recognized as the pure will to save. She lifted the small, convulsing body. Leo was light in her arms. A featherweight. Arthur, finally reacting, lunged forward, thinking she was trying to run away with his son. But Helena turned, and her eyes met his. Helena's face was a mask of urgency. "It's the heat. He's burning up. I have to cool his body. Fast." Her voice was not a scream, but a command of authority. Arthur, in shock, watched her walk purposefully toward the bathroom. "What are you doing? Let him go!" he shouted, moving toward her, blind with panic. His body, used to commanding boardrooms, was now in attack mode. Helena stopped him with a look that seemed to drain the strength from him. A look not of defiance, but of pure, unquestionable protective instinct. "Trust me," she yelled back, the first time she had raised her voice. What happened next was a miracle of seconds. Arthur, the man who trusted only in numbers and his net worth to guarantee safety, stopped. His hand was inches from her arm. He saw the panic in Veronica, who was still screaming about protocols and risks, but in Helena's eyes, he saw determination, not malice. He saw a conviction that was missing from his own life, and, against all logic, against all his instincts as a wealthy, protected father, he relented. He trusted. Time folded in on itself. In the instant Arthur stepped back, he relinquished control, the one thing that, besides his vast fortune, gave him a sense of security. For one terrifying second, the entire world was reduced to that bathroom, that woman, and his son. Veronica let out a sharp cry, a mixture of horror and fury. "You let her do it. She's going to kill him. I'm calling the police. You'll be held responsible." Her threats, however, were like the buzz of a distant insect. The only sound that mattered was the frigid water meeting Leo's feverish skin. Helena didn't drop him. She submerged him with an almost sacred reverence, holding his small but firm body against her own. The thermal shock was immediate and brutal. For a moment, it seemed Veronica was right. Leo's body stiffened even more, and the seizure appeared to intensify, a violent reaction to the extreme cold. Arthur felt the floor disappear from beneath his feet. What had he done? What madness had he trusted? He, a man whose decisions moved millions of dollars and affected the cash flow of entire corporations, had just gambled his son's life on a stranger's intuition. "Get him out of there! Now!" Veronica shrieked, trying to push past Arthur to intervene. But Helena did not waver. She held Leo, whispering soft words in his ear, words lost in the rush of water, but whose tone was one of unshakable calm. "Easy, my angel. Calm the fire. Let the water take the fire away." She herself was trembling from the cold or the adrenaline, but her hands were steady. Arthur remained frozen at the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. These seconds were the longest, most painful speculation of his life. Every stock he'd ever bought, every investment in crypto or treasury bonds, was child's play compared to this. Here, the liability was unthinkable, the loss absolute. And then it happened. Slowly, Almost imperceptibly, the tide began to turn. The violent rigidity in Leo's limbs began to yield. The tremors, which had once racked his entire body, lessened in intensity, becoming softer spasms, then mere shivers. The guttural sound in his throat ceased, replaced by a deep, shuddering sigh. Helena lifted a hand from the water and touched the boy's forehead. The skin, which had been burning like a coal, was now merely hot. The feverish red in his face began to recede, leaving behind an exhausted pallor. Arthur watched, breathless, as the seizure dissolved into the icy water, as if the cold were, in fact, washing the sickness away. Finally, Leo's body went completely limp in Helena's arms. He was exhausted, unconscious, but his breathing was deep and regular. The storm had passed. Veronica stood in silence, her mouth agape, her cell phone forgotten in her hand. The protocol had failed, the science had failed, and the ancient wisdom, embodied in this drenched and trembling housekeeper, had triumphed. Helena, with infinite tenderness, lifted the boy from the tub, wrapped him in the softest towel she could find, and placed him in Arthur's arms. The father received his son as if he were receiving the greatest inheritance in the universe. He looked at Leo's serene face, now safe and at peace, and then lifted his eyes to Helena. She was no longer an employee. She was the guardian of his world, and in his mind, a single, overwhelming question began to form, forever changing the landscape of his life. The silence that followed was deeper than any the mansion had ever known. Arthur held Leo's sleeping body, feeling the soft, steady warmth of his breath against his chest. It was the most valuable sound in the world, a melody no fortune could compose. His knees buckled, and he sat on the edge of the bed, never taking his eyes off his son's serene face. The terror had dissipated, leaving in its place a gratitude so vast and overwhelming it left him breathless. Across the room, Helena stood, drenched, water dripping from her hair and clothes onto the priceless Persian rug. She didn't seem to care about the cold or the luxury surrounding her. Her eyes, filled with a deep fatigue, were also fixed on Leo, ensuring the peace was real. The quiet was shattered by Veronica's voice, shrill and venomous. "This is outrageous, barbaric. Do you have any idea what you've just allowed?" she hissed, her face red with fury. This woman," she spat the word like an insult, "subjected your son to a dangerous and archaic procedure. She could have killed him. Hypothermic shock, cardiac arrest. Do you understand the risks you ran on the hunch of an ignorant person?" She gestured wildly, her digital chart forgotten on the floor. "I have doctors, specialists, an entire protocol based on years of research, and you throw it all away for some backwoods healer's trick." Arthur slowly raised his head. His gaze, when it met Veronica's, no longer held the fear or uncertainty of before. There was a cold clarity, the same clarity he used to analyze a high-risk investment. "Your protocol, nurse," he said, his voice low but sharp as glass, "almost cost me my son. Your specialists, with all my money and resources, offered me a syringe that didn't work. Your years of research resulted in you standing there, shouting into a phone, while my son was seizing his way into an abyss." He glanced at Leo, then at Helena. "Her ignorance, as you call it, saved his life. The return on this act of courage is worth more than all the dividends from my stocks. It was the best investment I've made in my entire life, and I didn't even pay for it." The power shift was total and absolute. Veronica, the medical authority, the professional with impeccable credentials, shrank under the weight of his words. Arthur stood up, adjusting Leo in his arms. "Pack your things. Consider your services terminated as of this moment. A transfer covering your salary and a severance will be made to your account. Now, please leave this room." Veronica gaped, blinking as if she couldn't comprehend what she was hearing. Humiliated, Defeated, she shot a look of pure hatred at Helena before turning and storming out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed down the hall, the final punctuation on a chapter of fear and failure. Peace returned, deeper this time. Arthur gently laid Leo in his bed, covering him with a warm blanket. He then turned to Helena, who was still standing in the same spot, a silent statue. He looked at her, not as a boss to an employee, but as a man looks at an enigma. There was a calmness about her that was not normal, a wisdom in her eyes that went beyond experience. "I need to understand," he said, his voice now soft, almost a whisper. "How did you know? Not just about the water, but how did you know what was going to happen before it even started?" Helena looked down at her own hands, wet and calloused, as if the answer were traced in the lines of her palms. She didn't answer his question directly. Instead, she walked to the bed and gently touched Leo's leg over the blanket, an instinctive gesture of reassurance. Only when she was certain the boy's peace was stable did she turn back to the man whose world had just been turned upside down. "It's not about knowing, sir," she said, her voice low but clear in the quiet room. "It's about feeling, observing. A fever in a child isn't like a number on a stock chart that goes up and down. It's like a forest fire. You don't wait for it to reach the top of the mountain to fight it. The danger is in the speed it spreads on the way up. If you cut off its fuel at the start, it doesn't have the strength to burn everything down." Her analogy, so simple and earthy, struck Arthur with the force of a revelation. He, a master of business, of cash flow and profitability, who understood interest rates and complex financial instruments, had never thought of his son's condition with such clarity. He had always listened to the technical terms, Veronica's scientific explanations, and accepted them without question. The nurse had always insisted on waiting for the fever's peak to get clear data, to not mask the symptoms for the doctor. Now, her words sounded hollow, dangerously wrong. Helena's wisdom didn't come from a diploma, but from a fundamental connection to life, something all his capital could not buy. As Arthur processed this disconcerting truth, Veronica, in her own room down the hall, was emptying her drawers with a contained fury. She threw her clothes and belongings into an expensive suitcase, muttering about the ingratitude and stupidity of rich men who let themselves be swayed by cheap sentimentality. In her haste and anger, as she grabbed a case of medical supplies from her nightstand, she didn't notice a small glass vial, identical to the one she administered to Leo, slip out and roll under the dresser, coming to rest in the darkness. She snapped the suitcase shut, grabbed her purse, and left the mansion without a backward glance, leaving more than just a job behind. An hour later, with Leo sleeping deeply and the house in a strange calm, Helena got a bucket and a cloth. Despite what had happened, she was, after all, the housekeeper. It was her job to restore order. With a quiet dignity, she went to the room Veronica had vacated to clean it. As she knelt to wipe the floor under the dresser, her fingers brushed against the cool glass vial. She picked it up, thinking the former nurse had forgotten it, intending to give it to Arthur so he could return it. She took it to the study, where she found him sitting, staring into space. "Sir, excuse me," she said softly. "I think Miss Hayes left this behind." Arthur took the small vial. He knew these containers well. Each one represented a small fortune, a concentrate of imported hope that he paid for without hesitation. This tiny object alone cost the equivalent of grams of gold, but as he held it, something bothered him. Spurred by the new perspective Helena had given him, he began to question everything. He looked at the vial not as a desperate father, but as an investor examining a dubious asset. The label looked impeccable. The brand was from a renowned Swiss lab, but instinctively, he brought it to his ear and shook it. The sound was wrong. The liquid inside moved with the lightness of water, not the viscosity of a medical serum. His heart began to pound. With trembling hands, he broke the seal and removed the cap. And then he smelled it. Nothing. No chemical odor, no medicinal scent, just emptiness. The emptiness in that small vial was more deafening than any scream. Arthur felt a wave of cold wash over him, an ice that had nothing to do with Leo's bath, but with the deepest betrayal he could imagine. He looked at Helena, his eyes wide with a suspicion so monstrous he could barely form the words. Could it be? He, the billionaire, the man who built an empire on meticulous data analysis and calculated distrust, had been deceived in the most cruel and fundamental way. The idea was absurd, grotesque, yet the lack of smell, the watery consistency of the liquid, the failure of the medicine during the crisis, the pieces began to click into a terrifying mosaic. "Helena," he said, his voice a thread, "please stay here." Without another word of explanation, he stood and walked briskly to Leo's room. He opened the small medical refrigerator where Veronica kept the medications and took another sealed box of the same imported serum. He brought it to his study, his heart hammering against his ribs. He sat at his mahogany desk, the vial Helena had found on one side, the new box on the other. He placed them side by side. They were identical, same label, same lot number. With a silver letter opener, he sliced the seal on the new box, took out the vial, and opened it. The same olfactory silence greeted him. A cold, calculating fury began to replace the shock. It was the same fury that guided him when he discovered fraud in his businesses, a manipulation of his stocks on the market. He picked up the phone and called his personal attorney, a man used to handling multi-million-dollar disputes. "Marcus," Arthur said, his voice dangerously calm, "I need a favor. Urgent. I want you to send a courier to my house now. He's to pick up a sample of a medication. I need it analyzed by an independent lab, the best you can find. I want a full toxicology report, the exact composition, everything, and I want it yesterday." While he waited, a new dimension of the horror opened up to him. If these drugs were nothing, then what had Veronica been doing all this time? Why would she keep him in a cycle of panic and hope, administering placebo after placebo? The image of the nurse, always so professional, so calm, began to distort in his mind. Her insistence on protocol, her refusal to try alternative approaches, her almost sadistic calm as Leo's fever rose. It all took on a new, sinister meaning. It wasn't professionalism, it was control. She wasn't trying to cure his son, she was managing his illness. Helena watched Arthur from across the room, silent. She didn't understand the specifics of what was happening, but she felt the shift in the atmosphere. The gratitude and relief had been replaced by a dark, heavy tension. She saw the pain in Arthur's face transform into a mask of icy rage. She, who had entered this house to clean the dust, was now at the epicenter of an emotional earthquake that threatened to bring down the family's foundations. She approached slowly. "Mr. Dumont," she said softly, "are you all right?" He looked up at her. His gaze was no longer that of a lost man, but of a predator. "Helena," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded different, laden with a new weight. "I think you didn't just save my son's life once tonight. I think you saved him from something much, much worse than a fever." He paused, looking at the vials on his desk as if they were snakes. "And I think you and I have a great deal to talk about. But first, I need you to promise me something. I need you to not leave Leo's side, not for a second." The night that followed was a silent vigil. Arthur dismissed the rest of the staff, craving absolute isolation. The vast mansion, usually a hub of discreet activity, became a silent mausoleum, inhabited only by a terrified father, a sleeping child, and the woman who had become their anchor. Helena, true to her promise, did not leave Leo's side. She pulled an armchair close to the bed and remained there, a sentinel of calm. Every so often, she would rise, not to check a monitor, but to place her hand on Leo's forehead, a gesture as old as motherhood itself. Arthur, unable to rest, watched her from the doorway. He, a man whose net worth was measured in billions, who understood the complex architecture of hedge funds and the volatile dance of cryptocurrency, felt like a complete amateur in the most fundamental art, that of caring. He brought Helena a cup of tea. She accepted with a tired but genuine smile. "You need to rest too, sir," she said, her voice a whisper. "I can't," Arthur admitted, sinking into another armchair. "My mind is trying to calculate the incalculable. I built my fortune on being skeptical, on analyzing every detail of a deal, every clause of a contract. I ran background checks on every executive I ever hired. But for the person I entrusted with my son's life, I just wrote the check." The bitterness in his voice was palpable. "I paid a fortune, Helena, thousands of dollars a vial for nothing. Money doesn't buy trust, sir. It buys a service," Helena replied with her disarming simplicity. "And no, trust is something else. It's born from what you see, what you feel. You were afraid. And fear is a poor advisor for any investment, whether on Wall Street or in the heart." Her words, again, hit their mark. He had never thought of trust as an asset to be cultivated, but rather as a liability to be mitigated with contracts and background checks. The night wore on. They spoke little, but a deep understanding grew in the shared silence. Arthur saw in her not just a savior, but a woman of a strength and integrity he rarely encountered in his world of high finance and high society, a wealth of character that couldn't be listed on any balance sheet. The morning sun cast pale rays through the tall windows when Arthur's phone finally rang. His lawyer's name, Marcus, glowed on the screen. Arthur felt a knot in his stomach. He moved to a corner of the room, answering with a simple, "Talk to me?" Helena watched his face as he listened. She saw the tension in his jaw, the way his knuckles went white as he gripped the phone. She saw the color drain from his face, replaced by a marble pallor. He didn't say a word, just listened, his body rigid as a statue. When the call ended, he didn't hang up. He just lowered the phone slowly, his gaze lost, fixed on the opposite wall. The silence in the room was heavy, electric. "Mr. Dumont?" Helena asked, her own heart tight with apprehension. He turned to her, and the eyes that met hers were those of a man who had stared into the abyss and found something worse than emptiness. "The lab confirmed it," he said, his voice hoarse, almost unrecognizable. "There was no medicinal component, none. It was a sucrose solution. Sugar water, Helena." He paused, swallowing hard, the monstrous truth forming on his lips. She wasn't just failing to treat him. She was making him sick, intentionally. For what? Why would anyone do that? The words, sugar water, fell into the silence of the study like stones on a frozen lake, shattering the surface of reality. Arthur repeated them, not as a question, but as a sentence. The enormity of that simple phrase was a poison spreading through his veins. It wasn't just negligence, it wasn't medical malpractice, it was a deliberate act. A cruel and meticulously maintained charade that had gone on for months. He looked at his own hands, the hands that signed the checks, that approved the wire transfers for the purchase of overpriced placebos. He had financed the torture of his own son. The guilt hit him with the force of a physical blow, knocking the wind out of him. Why? The question echoed in his mind. A labyrinth with no exit. What was the point of such cruelty? Helena, unlike Arthur, did not seem shocked, but rather immersed in a deep, knowing sadness. She saw past the fraud, into the dark heart that had conceived it. "Sir," she began, her voice impossibly gentle amidst the storm of Arthur's emotions, "sometimes people don't do things out of malice as we understand it. They do them out of a pain so great it turns their world inside out, a pain that blinds them. Pain." Arthur spat the word. What kind of pain justifies turning a child's life into an experiment, a lie? This isn't business, it's not logical, there's no profit in it. She watched him seize, she watched him suffer, and she kept giving him sugar. He stood and began to pace, the caged energy of a man who needed to destroy something. I built my net worth on being able to predict people's moves, to understand their motives, greed, power, fear. I understand all of that. But this is a void, a black hole. Spurred by the terrifying possibility Helena's words had opened, he picked up the phone again. He called Marcus, his lawyer. Marcus, forget the lab. The job is different now. I want to know everything about Veronica Hayes, everything. I want her history, her family, her medical records. If you can get them, hire the best private investigators. I don't care about the cost. I want to understand what turns a nurse into a monster. The order was given. Now there was only the wait. The next few hours were the longest of Arthur's life. He and Helena remained in the study, bound by a complicity born of trauma. He spoke of his business, of the complexities of managing such a vast inheritance, not as a boast, but as a confession of how futile it all seemed now. Helena listened, and in her eyes he saw no judgment, only a quiet compassion that disarmed him. She spoke of her own life, of the simplicity of raising children with few resources, where the only wealth was love and attention. The sun was setting when the phone rang. It was an unknown number. Arthur answered, putting it on speaker. "Mr. Dumont, this is Rick Evans with the investigative agency. We have the initial information on Veronica Hayes." Arthur held his breath. Helena leaned forward. "It wasn't easy. The woman is extremely private," the investigator said, "but we found something in her public records, a starting point. She had a son." The man's voice paused, as if hesitant to continue. "He died 6 years ago. He was 5 years old." A dead silence fell over the room. Arthur felt the floor give way. "How did he die?" Arthur asked, his voice a whisper that barely escaped. The investigator's answer was the final blow, the piece that completed the infernal puzzle, revealing a picture of psychological horror neither of them could have anticipated. According to the death certificate, sir, the cause of death was complications from a febrile seizure. The investigator's revelation was not an answer, it was the breaking of a seal on a forgotten tomb. The air in the study grew thin, heavy with the ghost of an unknown child. Arthur felt as though the marble floor beneath his feet had turned to thin ice. It wasn't malice, it was something infinitely more complex and terrifying. It was an echo. Veronica hadn't been trying to cure Leo. She had been trying, desperately and pathologically, to rewrite her own past. She was keeping Leo on the threshold of crisis, in the very place where she had lost her own son, so that she could, this time, manage him, to have the chance to save him that life had denied her. The cycle of fevers and placebos wasn't a treatment, it was a macabre ritual of grief and denial. "My God," Arthur whispered, sinking into his chair. The fury he had felt before, the cold, calculating anger of a betrayed businessman, evaporated, replaced by a soul-chilling horror. She didn't hate him, she loved him. But it was a sick love, a ghost's love. She looked at my son and saw her own. He thought of all the money he had spent, every wire transfer to Switzerland, every euro invested in buying vials of sugar water. He hadn't been the victim of a financial scam targeting his net worth. He had been the unwitting sponsor of a madness born from pain. Helena came closer and, with a simple, natural gesture, placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder. The touch was light, but it had the weight of an anchor. "Duty, there is nothing in the world more lost than the heart of a mother who has buried a child," she said, her voice low, laden with a wisdom that didn't come from books. "Some hearts heal, others, they break into so many pieces they never fit back together right." Her soul was lost that day, sir, and she's been walking in the dark ever since. Helena's words weren't a plea for forgiveness for Veronica, but an explanation that Arthur's logical mind would never have reached on its own. He, who measured the world in assets and liabilities, in profitability and risk, was forced to confront a type of accounting he didn't know, that of human sorrow. For the first time, he felt a pang of something resembling pity for the woman who had nearly destroyed his family. It was a confusing, disturbing emotion that mingled with the horror and disgust. He looked at Helena. In the soft lamplight, he saw the lines of concern on her face, the quiet strength in her eyes. She had faced panic and imminent death with courage. Now, she faced madness and tragedy with compassion. What kind of wealth did she possess that made her so unshakable? He realized, with a painful clarity, that his own fortune, his empire of business and investments, was a fragile armor against the true terrors of life. He was a billionaire in terms of capital, but a pauper in emotional wisdom. The attraction he had felt for her, born of gratitude and admiration, deepened in that moment, becoming something more reverent. She was not just his son's savior. She was the translator of a world he did not understand. "What do you do with a pain like that, Helena?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "What do you do with someone so broken?" The question hung in the air, freighted with implication. He had the power and the resources to crush Veronica. He could turn her over to the authorities, ensure she never practiced again, expose her story to the world. It would be his revenge, his right. He picked up the phone, his finger hovering over his lawyer's contact. The justice of a wealthy man is swift and unforgiving. But then he looked at Helena's serene face and at the door to the room where his son slept. Safe. Vengeance suddenly seemed like an empty, tasteless dish. Slowly, he lowered the phone, a decision forming in his mind, a decision that had nothing to do with laws or money, but with a different kind of power. The weight of the phone in Arthur's hand was the weight of 2 lives. Veronica's, which he could crush with a single call, and his own, which would be forever defined by the choice he made in this instant. Vengeance would be easy, an almost reflexive act of his business instincts, where weakness is exploited and betrayal is punished with the opponent's total annihilation. He could use his immense capital to fund a legal battle that would leave her in ruins, a footnote in his story of success and power. It would be justice, his lawyers would say. It would be closing out the liability, his risk managers would say. But looking at Helena, whose quiet presence was a testament to a strength not listed on any balance sheet, he knew that wasn't the answer. The real return on investment was not in revenge, but in redemption. Slowly, with the deliberation of a man signing the most important contract of his life, he dialed his lawyer. Helena watched, her heart in her hands, not knowing which path he would take. "Marcus," Arthur said, his voice firm but devoid of all previous fury, "about the Veronica Hayes case, I have new instructions." There was a pause. "I want you to find the best psychiatric treatment facility in the country. The absolute best. Cost is no object. Use our funds. Create an endowment if you have to, but guarantee her a place. You will contact her, not with a subpoena, but with an offer of help. Explain that there will be no charges, no legal action. The only condition is that she commits herself and begins treatment. Tell her one father understands another's pain." He hung up. The click of the phone was the loudest sound of the night, the sound of a door closing on vengeance and another opening to something he barely dared to name. He turned to Helena, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he looked completely vulnerable. The multi-millionaire's armor dissolved, leaving only the man beneath. "You saved my son, Helena," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "You pulled him from the fire, and then you stopped me from throwing myself into my own flames. I've lived my entire life building an empire, accumulating assets, gold, stocks, a net worth that looks like a phone number. I protected myself with the highest wall money can build. But tonight, I realized I was living in an empty castle, haunted by fear. My greatest wealth wasn't in treasury bonds or Bitcoin. It was sleeping in that room, and I almost lost it. He took a step toward her, the space between them shrinking, charged with a soft electricity. You came here with nothing but your hands and your wisdom, and in less than a week, you've given me something no inheritance ever could. You've given me peace. You've taught me that life's greatest dividend isn't profit, but compassion. His eyes, which once analyzed charts and market trends, now studied her with an intensity that made her hold her breath. He saw in her his salvation, the missing piece not just in his son's safety, but in the architecture of his own soul. "I can't go back to the man I was yesterday," he whispered, the final confession. "And I don't want to. The truth, Helena, is that you didn't just save Leo. You saved me from myself." He stopped inches from her, his heart laid bare, the biggest gamble of his life on his lips. "So I'm asking you, stay. Not as my employee, not as the housekeeper. Stay as the guardian of this family, the guardian of my son." He paused, his voice breaking with the weight of his final offer. "And the guardian of my heart." Arthur's words hung in the air, more valuable and terrifying than any stock offering. For Helena, a woman accustomed to the solidity of the earth and the simplicity of labor, that declaration was uncharted territory, a new world for which she had no map. Her heart, which had been so steady and courageous in the face of crisis, now fluttered. She looked at her own hands, the same hands that had plunged a child into ice water, and then at Arthur's face, a face that, for the first time, was not that of an employer or a millionaire, but of a man offering up the pieces of his soul. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, a vulnerability all his money couldn't hide. "Mr. Dumont," she began, her voice a whisper, "I'm a simple woman. My whole life has been taking care of my home, my children, this mansion, this world. It's not mine. It wasn't mine either," he answered, his voice laden with a new truth. "I thought it was, but I was just a custodian. I was the caretaker of a fortune, the manager of a capital that had no warmth. You showed me what a real home is. It's not the marble walls, Helena. It's the feeling of safety, that the most important flame is protected." He gently took her hands in his. His hands, soft and used to signing checks, enveloped hers, calloused and strong. "I'm not offering you a business deal. This isn't an investment with an expected return. It's a plea. I need your strength. Leo needs your heart. And I need to learn how to live again, not just survive." At his touch, Helena's last barrier crumbled. She didn't think of the assets, the wealth, or the net worth that surrounded him. She thought of Leo's laugh, of the trust the boy placed in her, and of the look in Arthur's eyes, a look that saw her not as a housekeeper, but as the woman she was. "I'm already the guardian of his heart," she said, a small smile forming on her lips. "And maybe I can help look after yours too." The acceptance was quiet but total. A deep peace settled over the study, the resolution of all the conflicts that had haunted the house. Later that morning, Arthur received a call from his lawyer. Veronica's family had been contacted. Shocked but grateful for the lack of charges, they accepted the help. The former nurse was admitted to a facility where she could, at last, begin to face her own ghosts. Arthur's justice was not punitive, it was healing, a reflection of the man he was becoming. By noon, the sun streamed through the living room windows. Leo, fully recovered and bursting with energy, raced across the carpet, chasing a small sunbeam. He laughed, a crystal-clear sound that filled every corner of the house, cleansing the last vestiges of fear. Helena sat on the sofa watching him, her heart overflowing with a love that was both fierce and tender. Arthur entered the room and stopped, taking in the scene. His son, healthy and happy. The woman he loved, the center of his new universe. In that instant, he understood the true meaning of net worth. It wasn't the sum of his assets minus his liabilities. It was this moment. It was his son's laughter, Helena's smile. He came and sat beside her, his shoulder brushing hers lightly. Together they watched Leo play. The storm had passed. The house was no longer an empire of fear, but a sanctuary of love. The family, once broken and incomplete, was finally whole. A month later, Arthur Dumont's mansion breathed an air it had never known. The oppressive silence had been replaced by the sound of a small toy car rolling across the marble and the echo of a child's laughter nesting in the once shadowed corners. The hallways, formerly galleries of sterile wealth, were now racetracks and hiding spots. Helena had brought life into the mausoleum, and with it, a new definition of fortune. Arthur discovered that the sound of his son's laugh was a more precious dividend than any paid by his most profitable stocks. He, who once ruled an empire from his study, now spent his afternoons on the living room floor, building block towers that inevitably collapsed under Leo's happy assaults. The screen displaying stock tickers and Bitcoin prices was now permanently dark. The only return on investment that interested him was the joy on his son's face. Leo flourished under the combined care of Helena's calm and his father's rediscovered love. The high fevers never returned with the same ferocity, and on the rare occasion his temperature rose slightly. Helena acted with the same serenity as that fateful night. Cool cloths, a lukewarm bath, and the calm in her voice were more effective than any expensive medicine. Fear had been banished from the house, not by locks or security systems, but by the presence of a woman who understood that the greatest protection is love. Arthur, the man who was once a billionaire, held hostage by panic, now found in a simple lullaby sung by Helena, a security that no bank vault or treasury bond could offer. On an autumn afternoon, as the sun painted the garden in shades of gold, the three of them sat on the veranda. Leo, sleepy after an afternoon of play, had fallen asleep with his head in Helena's lap. Arthur watched the scene, his heart flooded with a gratitude so intense it was almost painful. He thought of his previous life, a succession of deals, acquisitions, the accumulation of assets. He had built a vast fortune, an impressive collection of assets, but only now did he realize his soul had been full of undeclared liabilities, loneliness, fear, emptiness. Helena, who owned nothing, had given him everything. "You know," he said, his voice low so as not to wake the boy. "I spent years studying cash flow, analyzing interest rates, chasing the best returns. I thought I understood value." He looked at her, at the serene face that held all his peace. "I was wrong. The greatest capital a man can have is this." He gestured softly, encompassing the scene, her, his sleeping son, the golden sunlight. "This is the true inheritance I want to leave him. Not the dollars, not the businesses, but the memory that he was loved with a force that moved the world." Helena smiled, a smile that lit up her entire face. She reached out her free hand and placed it over his. "Love isn't an investment, Arthur. It's the only treasure that grows the more you share it." In that touch, in that moment of perfect communion, Arthur Dumont, the multimillionaire, finally understood the secret. His house was no longer just a mansion, it was a home, and his empire, once a colossus of concrete and numbers, had finally found its true, unshakable foundation in the heart of a simple woman and the peaceful sleep of his son.